Hospital room in Houston, March 21st, 2025. Machines beeping softly. A family gathered around a bed, holding hands, whispering prayers. And in that bed lies a man who, 50 years earlier, was the most feared human being on the planet. A man who once knocked grown men unconscious with a single punch. A man so terrifying that even Muhammad Ali admitted, in private, that he was scared to get in the ring with him. But here, in this final moment, he isn't a monster. He isn't a champion. He's just a father, a husband, a preacher, surrounded by the 12 children who called him Dad, 5 of them sharing his exact name. Within hours, the news breaks across the world. Big George Foreman is gone, age 76. And almost instantly, something strange happens online. Millions of people who never watched him fight in his prime start typing the same question into Google. How did a man go from being the most dangerous fighter in boxing to the most beloved grandfather in America? That question is the whole story, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how it happened, including the parts nobody talks about. The night he almost died in a locker room, the comeback everyone said was a joke, the business empire that made him richer than boxing ever did, and the one fight against the greatest of all time that should have ended his career forever, but instead quietly built the man he was about to become. Stay with me, because this isn't just a boxing story. This is a story about rage, faith, failure, and the most unlikely second chance in the history of sports. Let's go back to the beginning. January 10th, 1949, Marshall, Texas. A baby boy is born into a family that already has almost nothing. His mother, Nancy, is raising 7 children essentially alone, working multiple jobs just to put food on the table. The family soon moves to Houston's 5th Ward, one of the poorest, most violent neighborhoods in the entire city. People there don't call it a neighborhood. They call it the Bloody Fifth. Picture this: a skinny, oversized kid walking home from school, past broken glass and boarded-up windows, past men who've given up, and kids who never had a chance to start. There's no father figure steady in the home. There's barely enough food, and there's a boy growing up angry. Angry at being poor, angry at being hungry, angry at a world that seems to have already decided what he's going to become. By his early teens, George Foreman has dropped out of school. He's not in class. He's on the street. He becomes a mugger, robbing people for money, sometimes for nothing more than the thrill of having power over somebody, anybody, for just a few seconds. He later admitted, with brutal honesty, that he wasn't proud of who he was during those years. He was, in his own words, becoming exactly the kind of man his neighborhood expected him to become. Another statistic, another headline nobody would remember. And then, one night, something happens that terrifies him more than any fight ever would. He hears on the radio that police are looking for a mugger matching his description. He runs home, heart pounding, and hides, not from the police, but from the realization of who he was turning into. That fear didn't turn into a redemption story overnight, but it planted a seed. Around that same time, a government program called the Job Corps was recruiting young men from struggling communities, offering training, discipline, and a way out. George signed up, not because he had some grand vision of becoming a champion, but because it meant food, shelter, and a paycheck. It was survival, not ambition. It was at Job Corps that he met a man named Charles "Doc" Broaddus. Broaddus saw something in this angry, oversized teenager that nobody else had bothered to look for. Not just raw power, but discipline waiting to be unlocked. He introduced George to boxing. Now here's something most people don't know. George Foreman didn't fall in love with boxing because he dreamed of Olympic glory. He said it himself, Years later, he got into the sport because he wanted to lose weight and become a better street fighter. That's it. No grand plan, no destiny. Just a scared, angry kid trying to survive, who happened to be handed gloves instead of a life sentence. But once he stepped into that ring, something clicked. All that rage, the hunger, the anger at being poor, the fear of becoming another forgotten name from the Fifth Ward, it had somewhere to go now. Every punch was an argument with his own past. Within a shockingly short time, this teenager, who had never had formal training, was outclassing experienced amateur fighters. By 1968, at just 19 years old, George Foreman qualified for the United States Olympic boxing team, heading to Mexico City for the Summer Games. And here's where the story takes a turn that most biography videos skip completely, because it involves one of the most controversial moments in Olympic history, and George Foreman was standing right in the middle of it. 1968 wasn't just an Olympics, it was a political explosion. Just days before Foreman's gold medal fight, two American sprinters, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, stood on the medal podium and raised black-gloved fists into the air, a silent, powerful protest against racial injustice in America. It shook the entire world. It also created a firestorm back home. Then, after Foreman won Olympic gold in the super heavyweight division with a dominant performance, he did something that split America right down the middle. He grabbed a small American flag and waved it around the ring, smiling, in what looked to many like a moment of pure patriotic pride. To some, it was inspiring. A poor kid from Texas, representing his country with joy. To others, especially in the context of what Smith and Carlos had just done, it looked like a rejection of the protest, a message that contradicted the fight for civil rights happening across the country. Foreman would spend years explaining that it wasn't a political statement at all. It was simply raw excitement, an uneducated kid overwhelmed with joy in the biggest moment of his young life. But the controversy followed him regardless, shaping public perception of him for years. He came home an Olympic champion, and also, in the eyes of many, a controversial figure before he'd even thrown a professional punch. Now, here's where the legend really begins to build. George Foreman turned pro, and what followed was nothing short of terrifying for his opponents. He wasn't just winning fights, he was ending them, often in a single round, with a combination of raw power and a menacing, silent presence that made grown professional boxers visibly nervous just walking to the ring against him. He rarely smiled, he barely spoke. Sports writers started calling him one of the most intimidating athletes alive. By January 1973, Foreman was ready to challenge for the heavyweight championship of the world against the reigning, undefeated champion, Smokin' Joe Frazier, in Kingston, Jamaica. Frazier was supposed to win. He was the champion. He'd already beaten Muhammad Ali. Nobody expected what happened next. Foreman dropped Frazier to the canvas 6 times before the fight was stopped in the second round. Legendary broadcaster Howard Cosell's call, "Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier," became one of the most iconic moments in sports broadcasting history. In an instant, the 24-year-old kid from the Fifth Ward was heavyweight champion of the world. He seemed unstoppable, unbeatable, a wrecking machine with no weaknesses. And that's exactly the mindset he carried into a jungle in Africa, for a fight that would haunt him and ultimately transform him for the rest of his life. October 1974, Kinshasa, Zaire. The fight is billed as the Rumble in the Jungle. On one side, undefeated champion George Foreman, a walking demolition crew who had never truly been tested. On the other, Muhammad Ali, older, coming back from exile, and considered by nearly every expert to be walking into a slaughter. Foreman later admitted He expected to knock Ali out within 2 or 3 rounds. Instead, Ali did something nobody anticipated. He leaned back against the ropes, covered up, and let Foreman throw punch after punch after punch, a strategy the world would come to know as the rope-a-dope. Round after round, Foreman swung with everything he had, burning through his energy against a man who simply absorbed it and waited. By the 8th round, the unstoppable machine had nothing left. Ali came off the ropes and knocked Foreman down for the first time in his professional career. George Foreman, the most feared man in boxing, lay on the canvas in front of the entire world, beaten not by superior power, but by a plan he never saw coming. It was, without question, the most devastating loss of his life, and it didn't just cost him a championship belt. It cracked something deep inside him. Foreman fought on for a few more years, but something had shifted. He was angrier, more withdrawn, chasing a rematch and a redemption that never fully came. Then, in March 1977, after a grueling loss to Jimmy Young in Puerto Rico, something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his life. Something far more important than anything that had happened in any boxing ring. In the dressing room after that fight, exhausted and overheated, Foreman collapsed. He later described what happened next as a near-death experience, a moment where he felt he was dying, and in that terror, he says he encountered God. He describes crying out, begging for a second chance at life, promising to change if he was allowed to live. Whatever that moment truly was, it changed him permanently. George Foreman walked away from boxing entirely, not for a break, not for a rebuild. He believed his fighting days were over for good. He became an ordained minister, opened a small storefront church in Houston, and started preaching on street corners to anyone who would listen, the same streets, in some cases, that he used to rob as a teenager. For nearly a decade, the most feared heavyweight in the world disappeared from boxing completely, choosing sermons over swings, scripture over sparring. He also poured his energy into founding the George Foreman Youth and Community Center, a place designed to give kids from neighborhoods just like his own Fifth Ward a chance to escape the same traps that nearly swallowed him whole. And then, in 1987, at 38 years old, nearly a decade after retiring, carrying far more weight than his prime fighting days, George Foreman announced he was coming back to boxing. The reaction was almost universal ridicule. Sports writers called it a publicity stunt, a joke, a washed-up preacher chasing nostalgia for a paycheck. Nobody believed a heavyweight in his late 30s, out of the sport for a decade, had any business back in a professional ring. But Foreman didn't come back angry this time. He came back different, calmer, funnier, seemingly at peace, cracking jokes with reporters, poking fun at his own weight and age. And fight after fight, win after win, the joke kept refusing to end. In 1991, he challenged for the heavyweight title against Evander Holyfield and lost a competitive decision, but earned respect for lasting all 12 rounds against a champion in his prime. The comeback wasn't a joke anymore. It was becoming something historic. Then came November 5th, 1994. 45 years old, facing the much younger, heavily favored champion Michael Moorer in Las Vegas. For round after round, Foreman absorbed punishment, looking exactly like what critics predicted, an old man out of his depth. And then, in the 10th round, he threw a short, perfectly placed right hand. Moorer collapsed. George Foreman, at 45 years old, 10 years after most people assumed his career was finished forever, became the oldest heavyweight champion in the history of boxing. He fell to his knees in the ring, not celebrating like a warrior, but praying like the preacher he'd become. It remains one of the most improbable comebacks in the history of sports. But George Foreman's story wasn't finished, because the second act of his life wasn't really about boxing at all. It was about to become about a grill. In 1994, around the same time as his historic comeback, Foreman lent his name to a simple countertop grilling machine designed to cook fatty foods while draining the grease away, marketed under his name as the George Foreman Grill. Almost nobody, including Foreman himself, predicted what would happen next. The grill became one of the most successful product endorsements in American history. Over 100 million units sold. At the peak of its popularity, Foreman revealed he was earning astonishing monthly sums just from grill royalties, at times, reportedly, around $8 million a month. In 1999, the company that made the grill paid Foreman a lump sum, reported at roughly $137 million, to buy out his share of future earnings. By the time he passed away, his net worth was estimated at around $300 million. Let that sink in for a second. George Foreman made more money smiling on late-night infomercials selling kitchen appliances than he ever made getting punched in the face for a living. The man who once terrified the entire heavyweight division became one of the most trusted, beloved faces in American advertising, a walking symbol of second chances. Behind the boxing and the business, though, was a personal life almost nobody could keep track of. George Foreman was married 5 times. He had 12 children, 5 sons and 7 daughters. And in one of the most talked about decisions of his life, he named every single one of his sons George Edward Foreman, George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, and George VI, explaining that no matter what happened in life, they would always have something in common, something connecting them back to each other and to him. To outsiders, it seemed unusual. To Foreman, it was a statement about family, identity, and never being forgotten. He wasn't without criticism either. Some questioned his intense, almost frightening public image during his first boxing era, calling him distant and unapproachable. Others scrutinized his sudden religious transformation, wondering if it was genuine or strategic. And that Olympic flag-waving moment in 1968 continued to spark debate for decades, with people on different sides of the political spectrum interpreting it in completely different ways. Foreman rarely got defensive about any of it. He simply kept living, kept preaching, kept showing up. There's a lesser-known piece of his story, too, something most highlight reels leave out completely. Long before the grill, long before the comeback, Foreman struggled financially, even as a world champion, partly due to poor management of his earnings during his first boxing run. That financial vulnerability is part of why the comeback in his late 30s wasn't purely about pride. It was also about supporting a large, growing family and funding the youth center he'd built with his own hands. The joke comeback that shocked the sports world was, underneath it all, a father doing whatever it took to provide. By the time he formally retired from boxing in 1997, his professional record stood at 76 wins against 5 losses, 68 of those wins coming by knockout, a resume that places him among the most devastating punchers in heavyweight history. In the decades that followed, George Foreman became something even bigger than a boxer or a businessman. He became a symbol that failure isn't final, that the worst loss of your life, even one that happens in front of the entire world, doesn't have to define the rest of your story. That a scared kid from the bloody Fifth Ward, a teenage mugger running from his own future, could rebuild himself not once, but twice. First from anger into discipline, and then from a shattered champion into a joyful, faithful, wildly successful elder statesman of American life. When the news of his passing spread on March 21, 2025, tributes poured in from every corner of the sports world and beyond, from fellow boxing legends, from entertainers, from millions of ordinary people who grew up watching him sell grills with that same disarming, gap-toothed smile that once seemed impossible for a man once known as one of the most terrifying fighters alive. Because that's really the heart of this whole story, isn't it? George Foreman spent the first half of his life being feared, and he spent the second half of his life being loved. Most people never get one defining chapter. He wrote two completely different ones, and made both of them legendary. He once said that the true test of a man's character isn't how he handles winning, it's how he handles being knocked down, and whether he gets back up not just physically, but as an entirely different person. George Foreman got knocked down in a jungle in Africa, in front of the entire planet, at the absolute peak of his power. And instead of it ending his story, it became the turning point that led to a preacher, a father of 12, a business icon, and eventually, the oldest heavyweight champion the world has ever seen. From the bloody Fifth Ward to Olympic gold, from a terrifying silent destroyer to down goes Frazier, from flat on his back against Muhammad Ali to a dressing room revelation that sent him into ministry. From a decade away from the sport to becoming, at 45 years old, a living miracle in a boxing ring. And from all of that, into becoming the smiling, beloved face cooking burgers in millions of American kitchens. That's not just a boxing story. That's proof that it is never, ever too late to become someone new. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do one simple thing before you go. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're telling stories just like this one every single week. Stories of people who got knocked down by life and found a way to stand back up. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of George Foreman's story hit you the hardest. And if you know someone who needs to hear a comeback story today, send this video to them right now, because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that their worst moment doesn't have to be their last chapter. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.